I move that the House record its deep regret at the death on 25 June 2023 of the Honourable Simon Finlay Crean, a former leader and deputy leader of the Australian Labor Party, minister and member of this House for the division of Hotham from 1990 to 2013, place on record its appreciation of his meritorious public service and tender its sympathy to his family in their bereavement. Mr Speaker, it is 11 days since St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne was packed with mourners to pay tribute to a giant of the Labor movement and a great Australian, Simon Crean. Simon was a beloved son of the Australian Labor Party, whose personal qualities earned him a respect that didn't know any political boundaries. He was so many things, but above all, he was simply a very fine human being. It is so fitting to honour Simon Crean here in this place. Never buying into politics as a game, Simon was a true parliamentarian, understanding that this is where we are given the privilege to turn vision into reality. It was also here where he had some of his finest moments. When he opposed sending Australian troops to the Iraq War, he made it clear his argument was not with those in uniform, but with the decision of the Howard government. Each sentence he spoke in this place was as fierce and bright as a lightning strike. It was the stance he reiterated here in the presence of US President George W. Bush. But perhaps one of the most striking illustrations of Simon's character was the first of his Iraq speeches, when he went to speak with our troops ahead of their deployment from Australia. Though he did not believe Australia should be part of that war, he made clear to our troops that the respect and gratitude that he felt for them was deep and unwavering. It was a courageous act. That was Simon, a great Australian who served his country and community with humility and compassion, with integrity and intellect. He fulfilled so many roles: Secretary of the Storemen and Packers Union, ACTU President, Member for Hotham, Minister and Cabinet Minister in the Hawke, Keating, Rudd and Gillard governments, a Deputy Leader and then Leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. When he left formal politics, he continued to serve his nation as Chairman of the European Australian Business Council. Simon's ministerial career in itself was quite extraordinary. In portfolios as diverse as employment, training, regional development, trade, primary industries and science, Simon gave his all, characterised by inclusive engagement and a determination to make a positive difference. It was very much in Simon's favour that he possessed something that is rare in politics, a skin that was neither too thin nor too thick. Thick enough for him to survive the bumps of politics with his sense of humour intact, but a skin as well that was thin enough to be sensitive, for empathy, and to be moved by the world around him. We saw it in his great passion for the arts, which he understood was an essential part of the Labor mission. He knew a culturally confident nation has the strength to know itself and the imagination to enlarge itself. His final ministerial action was the launch of the cultural policy Creative Nation. A decade later, Simon's work provided the 5 pillars on which this government's cultural policy revive is based. We ensured that Simon was at the ESPY in St Kilda for the launch this year. He was energised and he was so proud. It was important that he was there. Simon served as minister in 4 Labor governments and was a living link with a 5th, yet he was still eager to offer advice to ours, not through the prism of nostalgia, but with his eye on the future. And I want to put on record my personal thanks for Simon's advice, particularly after I took over the position of leading the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. Simon was an instinctive reformer, innovator, and in his words, as he used to put it, you've got to join the dots. one who often greeted the world with a crinkle-eyed geniality, an apt introduction to this decent, kind and just generous man. Simon held the same values throughout his career, from his early union days trying to help some of the worst paid workers in Australia, dealing not just with wages but dealing with conditions and safety as well, right through to his trips to Europe in the name of Australian business and economic interests. In his maiden speech, he devoted himself to the national interest and the creation of, to quote him, a more just and equitable society. That is who Simon was, that's who he always was. So to Carol Crean, who joins us here today on the floor of the chamber, and to the Crean family, we pay our sincere condolences and our absolute respect. Carol gave quite an extraordinary tribute, along with others, his dear friend Bill Kelty at the Cathedral just 2 weeks ago. It was indeed a send-off that I believe was fitting for such a giant of the Labor movement. But as someone who observed close hand the relationship between Simon and Carol as well was as close as a couple I've ever seen. And so to Carol, to all of the Crean family, to Simon's many, many friends from across the political spectrum, many of whom, of course, joined with us at the Cathedral that morning. We pass on our condolences and we sincerely hope and pray that Simon Crean will rest in peace.
Call the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister in honouring the life of Simon Findlay Crean. I remember him as a giant of the Labor Party and a true gentleman. As the Prime Minister pointed out on the 23rd of January 2003, Simon, as a Leader of the Opposition, joined Prime Minister John Howard at Garden Island. There, on the deck of HMAS Canimbla, they farewelled our men and women in uniform bound for the Middle East. Simon did not mince his words. "I don't believe that you should be going," he said. "I don't support the deployment of our troops in these circumstances. I do support our troops and always will. My argument is with the government, not with you." In that speech, Simon did what so many had failed to do in the Vietnam War. He separated the politics from the people who serve their nation. He voiced his dissent to war in Iraq while maintaining the respect and reverence deserved by our men and women in uniform. As a student during the Vietnam War, Simon knew only too well the mistreatment levelled at many veterans. He had friends who fought, who came back from the war, and who were treated by demonstrators as pariahs. With Australia sending troops to a new war, Simon was determined to ensure the mistakes of a past war were not repeated. On show in that speech was Crean's candour, his courage, his conviction and compassion, which defined his character throughout his life. Such qualities were visible when Simon responded to John Howard in the House in subsequent weeks, where he said, and I quote, "I do not disagree with the outcome you seek, but I disagree fundamentally with the way you seek to achieve it." And such qualities were visible when Simon welcomed George W. Bush to Parliament when he said to the US President, "The Australian perspective is bound to differ from time to time from the perspective of the United States. Of course, on occasions, friends do disagree, as we did on this side with you on the war in Iraq." Simon was right when he said the issue of Iraq was one which created a clear divergence between the two major political parties. Yes, the coalition disagreed with Labor's view that Australia was simply or blindly following the United States, but Simon articulated his party's position with a certitude which was laudable. It was true leadership, and in many ways Simon Crean was destined to lead, to play a prominent role in public life. As we've read in the newspapers, his father Frank, a Treasurer and Deputy Prime Minister, was a primary influence. But there was also Frank's colleagues who joined the Crean family for Sunday dinners. For Simon, the treat was not just devouring his mother's roast, but imbibing the ideas of house guests like Evatt and Corwell and Whitlam. Now, with such an upbringing, it was no surprise that Simon joined the union movement. And he joined it soon after finishing his studies in economics and law at Monash University. And as Phil Curry noted, the university-educated Simon was one of the new breed of union officials. But Simon was very much old Labor in his championing of the working class. Indeed, the Age noted years later that his style was reassuringly suburban. He, of course, rose through the union ranks, from General Secretary of the Storeman and Packers Union to Vice President of the ACTU, before finally serving as the ACTU's President. His time as a union official was marked by major achievements. He helped to lay the foundations for universal superannuation, improve workplace safety, create new opportunities for skill and employment, and most importantly, negotiate the prices and incomes accord with Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. Years later, as the Minister of Employment, Education and Training, he would say, "Wasted and underutilised ambitions and aspirations tear at the social fabric of our society, with many unemployed people vulnerable to crime and drug abuse, suicides and broken homes." In those words, we get a sense of the kind-heartedness which drove Simon Crean. When Simon entered politics in 1990, winning the seat of Hotham, which he would hold for 23 years, Bob Hawke catapulted him straight into the ministry. The press pointed out Crean's parallels with Hawke. A right-wing Labor man, a union career, president of the ACTU, moved to politics fast-tracked to the top. His contributions to public life through politics were many and varied. He served dutifully and skillfully in numerous ministerial portfolios and in cabinet. He left his imprint on a plethora of policy areas, be it education and energy, trade and technology, science and social inclusion, workplace relations and our regions, and much more besides. Simon stood up for Australian women as an advocate for paid maternity leave and job flexibility. He didn't like to lecture about family values. Instead, he wanted policies which valued Australian families. And in 2002, he asked, "Is it any wonder our birth rate is declining when Australians simply can't afford to start a family or have a second or third child?" It's a question we're still grappling with today. Now, Simon was elected leader after the 2001 election loss, one of the lowest of low points for the Labor Party. It was a difficult time for any leader, with terrorism and border protection, among many other issues, front and centre of the national debate. His speechwriter, Dennis Glover, said that Simon was under more pressure than any Labor leader since John Curtin or Doc Evatt. Every day brought a new leak, another knife in the back and more ridicule. But for the man who would later admit he had never been afraid to take on the hard jobs, Simon was one to never shy away from hard debates or hard decisions, whether it was on the war in Iraq or indeed in relation to the union movement. As leader, Simon diluted union influence in party conferences by reducing the representation from 60 to 50%. He did it not because he wanted to put himself up in lights, but because he thought it was in the best interests of his party and a movement that he believed in wholeheartedly. From that moment, of course, Simon's Labor leadership was sadly on borrowed time. For those of us who were here then, we can recall a very unforgiving and bitter period of politics which followed and plagued the Labor Party, a time when careers and friendships were wounded. But under 4 Prime Ministers, Simon Crean dutifully served. But events would determine that he would not serve as Prime Minister. He was the first Labor leader since 1916 to be deprived of an opportunity to contest an election. Those memorable words of Macmillan, "Events, dear boy, events," rang true for Simon Crean. If fate was different and Simon had become leader of our country, he would have surely been a great Labor Prime Minister. In his maiden speech, he said, "I'm committed to placing the national interest first in developing through consultation and cooperation the most effective mechanisms for creating a more just and equitable society." Simon was known for his moderation and finding ways of reaching a middle ground. He was a listener. He was decent, he was humble, he was honourable, and he was moral. He put the nation and his party ahead of personal ambition, and it's telling that his final days were spent working in our national interest to further our trade relations with the EU. Simon's sudden passing was a shock to us all, no more so than to his dear family. Simon's adoration for his family surpassed anything else in life, even his beloved North Melbourne Kangaroos, where he served as the club's #1 ticket holder for many years. Certainly the club's renowned Shinboner spirit shone through everything Simon did in public life. He courageously tackled the difficult issues. He embraced the tough choices on the political football field. On behalf of the Coalition, I offer my heartfelt condolences to Simon's wife Carol, to daughters Sarah and Emma, to the wider Crean family and to his many colleagues and family. I had the pleasure to see Simon only a few months ago, but I had a greater privilege to know and work alongside, as so many of us did, the true gentleman, Simon Finlay Crean. May he rest in peace.
And I give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cyber Security.